All right, good afternoon. So, today I'm going to be talking to you about Ted Hughes's poem Bayonet Charge, in which he deals with the experiences of a soldier engaging in trench warfare during World War One, and in which he discusses the experiences of that soldier, a character he's invented for this poem, going over the top, coming out of his trench, and enacting a bayonet charge against the opposition. So, I'm going to be talking you through the form, the content, the structure of the poem, and I'm also going to be focusing specifically on the methods that Hughes uses in order to communicate his ideas about war and conflict. Before we start, just to touch on the context of this poem, while Hughes does talk about the experiences of a World War One soldier and trench warfare, he himself did not take part in World War One, although his father did. Hughes has spoken at length about the impact that his father's stories about the First World War had upon him as a child, the fact that the experiences that his father had have really clearly influenced his poem here, I think is quite clear to see. Okay, so let's work through this from the beginning to the end. I'm going to focus first of all on this first stanza, which begins with the line, "Suddenly he awoke and was running raw." So, you will have heard me comment before on the fact that this poem begins in the middle of the action. It begins in medias res, in the middle of the action. So it plunges us straight into the psychology and into this moment of drama, this moment of immediate fear for the persona, the soldier in this poem. Suddenly he awoke and was running. So we have the impression here that this soldier was not prepared for the moment of action, was not really given a lot of time to come to grips with the fact that he would be going over the top, getting out of his trench and running across no man's land, an incredibly dangerous stretch of land in which it was incredibly likely that a soldier would catch a bullet and would die. So he awoke and was running, raw. And this word raw, I think, is incredibly powerful. This would be such a useful micro quote to pick out and comment on. The use of that adjective raw, I think, has connotations of youth, the idea that he is unprepared, he's unready, he is raw. And I think it also has connotations of vulnerability. So perhaps the idea here that is being explored is the fact that many soldiers fighting in World War One would not have had extensive training, wouldn't necessarily have come from a military background, and wouldn't realistically have been ready to face the harsh conditions that World War One trench warfare demanded. So we get the sense here that this is a young soldier who is unprepared. And your connection there to context is that in World War One, many soldiers who enlisted had minimal training. Hughes continues, raw seemed hot khaki. So khaki, this is a reference to the uniform that the soldier would have been wearing, and that sense of raw seemed, I think, really evokes the idea that this uniform is new. He's not had a chance to break it in. The seams are still raw, it's uncomfortable, and it's perhaps feels heavy to wear. His sweat heavy. So immediately we get the impression that this isn't a soldier who is skillful, experienced, a veteran of this kind of combat. This is someone who's potentially unready. He's sweating, so perhaps he's afraid as well. And the poem begins with this immediate sense of discomfort. Now, if you compare this to other poems from within the collection which deal with the idea of war, have a look at Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a poem which really glorifies war, makes the soldiers seem heroic, makes them seem like really figures to be idolised and glorified. And then contrast that with Hughes's poem here, which seems to me to be so much more realistic, that focuses on these minute little details of the soldier's experience and helps us to understand the brutal reality of this type of warfare, the physical discomfort, the lack of preparation, the vulnerability of the individual soldiers. If Bayonet Charge gives us just this viewpoint into one soldier's experience, Tennyson's poem tries to teach us about all of the soldiers who died at the Battle of Balaclava. Here we are allowed just to focus on the pain, the suffering, the confusion, the bewilderment of one man. And more like Simon Armitage's poem Remains, this allows us to understand how war affects the individual, the powerful and often traumatic effects that war has upon individual soldiers. Okay, I digress. Let's continue. Stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge. So here again we had the verb here, stumbling, which communicates a sense of disorientation. Again, this is a real lack of grace here. There's no coordination. This is someone who is inexperienced, new to this kind of battle. Stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. And again, that verb, dazzled, suggesting brightness, suggesting a lack of clarity. Perhaps it's hard to see, and it dazzles with rifle fire. Now, this word here, or these words here, rifle fire, remind us the level of danger that was about to be experienced by this individual soldier as he is running across no man's land. There are bullets flying left, right, centre. He's surrounded by the possibility of death at any moment. So we have all of this sensory imagery here, dazzled with rifle fire, and then he hears bullets smacking the belly out of the air. Now, this is a line that if you look at any revision video, find people focus in on this one. I think it's really tremendously powerful. So let's just break it down for a moment. Firstly, this word hearing reminds us that this is an auditory sensation. We're looking at all of the different senses of the soldier. We're thinking about his physical movements as he stumbles across the field, the fact that the rifle fire dazzles him, perhaps makes it hard to see, and now he's hearing the bullets smacking the belly out of the air. So we're being immersed in all of his senses. We're understanding the complete perception that he has as he's running across this field. So, first of all, bullets smacking. This is an example of personification, as Hughes personifies the bullets themselves as violent. And smacking the belly out of the air communicates, I believe, a sense of rest, of breathlessness, as though he's been winded as he's running. He can't catch his breath. So smacking the belly out of the air evokes breathlessness, as though he is being winded. And we have these B sounds, these plosive B sounds. For those of you that like to comment on the effects of the particular syllables, the sound effects here that are being used within the language, that plosive B again has a sort of aggressive sound to it. Bullets smacking the belly out of the air. So here again, the verb smacking communicates a sense of physical violence again. But I think the next line, perhaps a little more undiscussed, is really equally powerful. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm. Now, a simple explanation of this line is to say that it uses a simile and it communicates a sense of pain, but there is so much more to it than that. Firstly, let's look at that verb, lugged. If you could couple together lugged with stumbling and dazzled, again, I think that this verb helps to communicate the inexperience of the soldier. He isn't brandishing this weapon. He isn't flourishing it. He's lugging it. It's a burden to him. It's something that he finds awkward and difficult to carry. And this again communicates his sense of inexperience. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm. And this word numb, I think, again, this adjective is really powerful. It suggests to us that this thing doesn't feel even like a part of him. It's this numb thing. But then the simile compares it to an arm, which makes it seem like it is a part of him, in fact. It feels like an extension of him. And later, within the second stanza, we have the repetition of sort of mechanical imagery in this line, in what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he, the hand pointing that second. I would argue that this reference to a rifle numb as a smashed arm begins the sense of the soldier as part of a machine, as though he himself is part of a machine. He is a weapon. And I think this line communicates the disposability of those soldiers, the way in which individual men were perceived as mere weapons, perceived as tools, looked upon by generals as expendable and disposable, and not regarded as individual humans with individual pain. So let's break that down. Lugged, communicating that sense again of discomfort and inexperience. Numb, perhaps this could also communicate something about the soldier's emotional state. Perhaps at this moment there is a slight numbness, a lack of emotion. Perhaps as he's coming to get to grips with what he's going through at the moment. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. And there again is that adjective communicating violence, communicating physical pain. These are its connotations. And I think overall this simile serves to evoke the idea of the rifle as an additional limb, as if it's part of him. The soldier is part of the war machine. And your AO3 connection there, is this going to fit on the screen? There we go. The AO3 connection, perhaps here Hughes is exploring the way that soldiers were viewed not as individuals, but as expendable parts of a wider war machine. And when I refer to the war machine, I'm talking about armies. I'm talking about enormous, vast numbers of soldiers, countries that were at war. And World War One, with its vast and horrific numbers of individuals killed, is often seen as a war in which soldiers were fighting this bloody war of attrition, in which individual lives were viewed as disposable, as men were forced to continue fighting in this incredibly bloody, incredibly aggressive, frequently futile trench warfare, which had extraordinarily high numbers of casualties. All right, let's continue. So this is our first glimpse, perhaps, in the next line of some of the ideas as to why this soldier chose to enlist. The patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. That adjective patriotic relates to the soldier's love of his country. We know, and you will, I'm sure, have looked at the propaganda posters which we argue were used to manipulate young men into enlisting in the army during World War One, which played upon ideas of patriotism, which played upon the idea of the soldier as a glorious, heroic figure. And this was a major factor in many young men choosing to enlist in the army. So the sense of patriotism here that has led him at some point almost to cry, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye now has been transformed into this sweat as he is running across this field. Now there's a lot of more interpretation that we can get out of these lines, but I think one of the most important things here is to look at the use of that past tense, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, i.e. it doesn't anymore. He isn't in this moment feeling that patriotism. And there's a connection here to be made with the end of the poem. If we look down at how he feels now, king, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm, which reminds us that these ideas of patriotism and of glory really become simply disposable, abstract concepts in a world in which this soldier is fighting every moment simply to survive. So, overall, this first stanza then creates a sense of speed, of pace, of action, and also introduces us to the world of discomfort and physical pain that this soldier, this persona, is experiencing. Within the poem as a whole, I would argue that this first stanza introduces a sense of chaos, disorientation, and utter bewilderment as the individual soldier attempts to comprehend this dramatic, this dangerous, this terrifying, frankly, moment that he is suddenly immersed in. And Hughes's language, this incredibly evocative, rich with imagery style of writing that he uses, helps us as readers to understand the reality and the brutality of trench warfare. And this, I would argue, is Hughes's overall aim. If you in your introduction want to comment on the big idea, the central concept of this poem, I would argue that it is this. Your AO3 point is that Hughes is exploring the brutal reality of trench warfare in World War I and reminding us as readers of the individual suffering experienced. And in this way as well, with that focus on individual suffering, I think there are really valid comparisons to be made here with Simon Armitage's poem Remains, which focuses on the psychological trauma that the soldier has undergone during a modern conflict. But I would also argue that there are connections here to be made with Poppies by Jane Weir, which reminds us to look at the poppies placed on individual war graves, to remind us that while there may be hundreds or thousands of casualties in any war, we must always remember these people who gave their lives as individuals, as complex humans who were someone's brother, someone's father, someone's sister, someone's aunt, someone's mother. We must remember them as individuals. So this is what Hughes is exploring here and exposing. Let's have a look then at this next stanza and notice as we do the use of enjambement all the way through that first stanza. There is no full stop, there's no pause for breath. And overall, that use of enjambement creates a sense of breathlessness. There is no pause, there is no stopping, because this stanza serves to establish a sense of action, pace and chaos. Hence, there are no stops, there's no pausing. Okay, let's continue. So, in this stanza, we have an end to that enjambement as Hughes slows the pace and introduces a more reflective and thoughtful tone in the second stanza, as our soldier suddenly wonders what he is doing. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. Bewilderment, very clearly illustrating the soldier's confusion. He doesn't for a second understand why he is engaged in this action. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? So we have an extended metaphor here which compares the individual soldier to part of a wider machine, cold clockwork. And he questions, what hand is he in this clockwork and in what direction is he pointing? In these two lines, this extended metaphor is used to question the role of the individual within the war machine. So it's an extended metaphor questioning the role of the individual within the war machine. Cold clockwork is an incredibly powerful metaphorical phrase to describe the instruments of war, the armies, the military. He personifies this, he uses the metaphor cold clockwork to describe these combined forces. And I think this is really powerful for two reasons. Number one, because the adjective cold used there connotes heartlessness and cruelty. And indeed, if we're to consider the actions of the generals within World War I, we can view them as cold and heartless in their ability to look upon these men as individuals, as disposable. And clockwork, the second part of that metaphor, suggesting that this is as abstract to the soldier as a piece of machinery. It's a large, complex structure, the minutiae, the details of which he does not understand. And this cold clockwork is made up of the stars and the nations. So this is a piece of machinery that is so vast that it encompasses not just the nations on earth, but the stars above. It seems to him, to the persona within this poem, unfathomably hard to comprehend. And he doesn't understand his role within it. In what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he, the hand, pointing that second? And finally, with the use of this question mark, we have a moment of pause. And this reflects the fact that the soldier has almost stopped running. So, this question mark serves to create a moment of pause as the soldier reflects. And this is an example of caesura. Look at that spelling. Caesura, that pause in the middle of a line, and it's purposefully in the middle of that line to emphasise that moment of hesitation, bewilderment and questioning that the soldier is experiencing. We continue. He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. So he's running like someone who's woken up in the middle of the night with a sense of panic and chaos and terror, and as he's running is listening for the thing behind him, the thing he is running from. So he has a complete sense of disorientation and confusion in these lines, leading to his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. And this simile here is used to illustrate the fact that he is simply stopped mid-stride, and again we have the use of caesura there to emphasise, in the middle of no man's land, an environment in which speed is incredibly vital to try and escape from or get out of the range of danger. He stops to question his role. He stops to question why he is doing this. And again, this reminds us of how vulnerable and how inexperienced this soldier is. This is not a moment to pause and reflect. This is a moment to run for your life. But for him, in that environment, he's so bewildered and so confused that he almost stops. And his foot is like a piece of statuary. He is as still as a statue in mid-stride. So, as similarly as the persona stops running and stands like a statue, and the caesura there used to emphasise that moment of pause, hesitation and questioning. Okay, however, then he is forced to continue, because then the shot slashed furrows. Shot slashed, so this is the ground that's been torn up by bullets. Bullets which at any moment could hit this persona, could hit this character, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. So the furrows are these sort of narrow grooves, narrow trenches in the ground, and a hair has burst up out of them. Now, there are lots of interpretations as to what specifically this hair could represent. Some have argued that the hair is a symbol of how war destroys nature, because it rolls like a flame and crawls in a threshing circle, which evokes a sense of absolute agony on the part of this innocent creature. So we might look at this image, this imagery, as an example of how war harms the natural world. And we might perhaps consider connections there with Wilfred Owen's World War I poem Exposure, which also deals with the relationship between war and nature. However, this has also been viewed as a metaphor in which the yellow hair represents another soldier, a cowardly soldier, as the word yellow also has connotations of cowardice. And this could again illustrate the cowardice of another soldier, rolling like a flame and crawling in a threshing circle, so potentially another soldier who has been injured or indeed is viewed as cowardly, as trying to get away and out of this situation. And yet a third interpretation holds that actually the yellow hair is symbolic of the persona's own fear and cowardly feelings in this moment, that actually he's desperate to run and get out of this situation which he's powerless to escape. So there's a lot to unpick there, But let's just look initially at these first two words, threw up, which has connotations of vomiting, of physical sickness. And again, this could reflect perhaps the soldier's feelings of nausea as he is running through this environment. The yellow hair rolls like a flame. So again, we have this simile here to suggest the kind of convulsive, frantic motions of this creature. Crawled in a threshing circle, mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. I think this is one of the most horrific images within this poem because it is an image of absolute suffering and an image of agony. Wide open, silent, eyes standing out, as though this creature is in horror at everything that it's seeing around it, as is, in fact, our persona. But our persona is forced to continue running. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. So in this moment of fear, in this moment when he stops, he suddenly sees the agony of another living creature, and the next thing we know, he plunged past. He's running again. So possibly we might infer from that the fear of pain that he could himself at any moment experience induces him, forces him, pushes him to keep running. But nevertheless, he continues aiming towards this vague, abstract goal of a green hedge. So, these final lines, I think, are among the most powerful in the poem, and I think they are really, really beautifully written by Hughes. We have this list: king, honour, human dignity, etc. These are perhaps the reasons for the soldier enlisting in the first place. He wanted to fight for king and country, wanted to fight for honour. So these could be some of his reasons, perhaps, for enlisting. These, we could argue, were some of the principles, some of the ideals that he was fighting for, some of the abstract concepts that were able to motivate him to enlist, to sign up, and to put his life in danger. And then human dignity seems like something simpler, following the lofty idealism of those first two words, king and honour. Human dignity, this as well is dropped, is thrown away, is discarded. And that final dismissive word, etc., suggesting that everything that's come before it, king, honour and human dignity, are as meaningless as the word etc. So that final word in the list evokes a sense of meaninglessness, as though this and this and this, they're just ideas, they're not life, they aren't survival, they aren't as important as managing to make it through the horror of this moment and live for another day. So all of these ideas, all of these ideals are dropped like luxuries. They are discarded, they are useless, they are futile in a survival situation that he is desperate to come through alive. Dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So all of these things become meaningless in a survival situation. So all the luxuries of the persona's ideals are discarded, are thrown away as he fights for survival. And Hughes maintains that sense of chaos and frenzy and frantic action right all the way and through to the end of this stanza in the words yelling alarm. That sense of noise, that sense of chaos, that sense of just pure blind fear. And this is what he wants to do. He's desperate to get out of that blue, crackling air. And I think this is really incredibly powerfully evocative imagery here. Blue, crackling air. Crackling just evokes the sense of tension. But it also, I think, reminds us of the sound, perhaps, of gunfire. As though the air itself is crackling, as though the air itself is somehow is somehow making this almost like electrical sound. It sounds perhaps blue crackling air. I think also evokes the ideas of lightning, that sense of a storm, that sense of chaos. There's a multitude of ways in which you could interpret that line, but I think it is powerfully sensory imagery and powerfully sensory language. And then this last line, again, can be interpreted in multiple ways, but here we get a sense of his absolute fear, and it is compared to dynamite. So this last line, Hughes uses a metaphor to compare his fear, to compare the persona's fear to an explosive. And again, right up until the very end of the poem, that tension is maintained. Aside from this moment of reflection in the second stanza, throughout the poem there's this sense of building pace, building momentum, building fear and anxiety as we experience, along with the persona, what it was like to go over the top, what it was like to run across no man's land. And to refer back to the sort of the big idea here, Hughes uses this poem to explore the brutal reality of trench warfare, how terrifying it was, how confusing it was, how psychologically unmanning it must have been to experience the absolute fight for survival when at any second you could be shot, you could be killed. To be surrounded by bloodshed and chaos and terror and know that you have no way of getting out of it, that the ideals that brought you to that moment do nothing to protect you or sustain you, and that actually all you want to do is run, and actually running is what you have to do if you want to survive. So hopefully that has been useful, giving you a little bit of a reminder here of the major kind of concepts behind Hughes's poem Bayonet Charge. In terms of what to compare this to, I would really think seriously about contrasting it with The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But there's also a really valid comparison to be made to Remains by Simon Armitage in terms of how both poems discuss the individual suffering brought about by war, and how both poems deal with individuals undergoing psychological trauma as a result of their experiences during conflict. All right. Again, thank you for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end of that, I am impressed. If there is anything else that you would like me to cover, please let me know. And in the meantime, good luck with all of your revision. Okay, thank you.